Howdy, I'm Kate Kavanaugh, and you're listening to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, where we're laying the groundwork for our land, ourselves, and for generations to come by looking at the way every thread of life is connected to one another. Communities above ground mirror the communities below the soil, which mirror the vast community of the cosmos. As the saying goes, as above, so below. Join me as we take a curious journey into agriculture, biology, history, spirituality, health, and so much more. I can't wait to unearth all of these incredible topics alongside you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Groundwork podcast, which we are still calling the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast because it is not the cream that has risen to the top of what feels like a never-ending to-do list. And I think for those of us that find ourselves in the thick of everything from harvests to back to school to shifting into Q4 and everything that comes with this last big push of the year, it just hasn't been the top priority, but it is on my mind. And hi, welcome to the Groundwork / Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, where we are exploring the threads of what it means to be humans woven into this earth. I am your ever grateful host, Kate Kavanaugh, and it is always a pleasure to sit down at my desk and have a chance to reflect on these intros. I'm going to give you a little warning at the top that this is a long intro, and it is with good reason. And I hope that, like with my other intros, you will stick with me because it is part of how I weave together these stories that we are telling and make sense of them. For me, first of all, but maybe also for you. So with that, I'm gonna dive in a little bit. So over the weekend, I was writing the newsletter for Western Daughters, and I wrote something in one of those moments of inspiration that I think you only find when you're doing something that you have to do and don't want to do, and something really surprising comes out. And that happened to me. And I've returned to this question that I asked in the newsletter, which is, what do I labor for? Labor Day was this past Monday, and it hit different than it has in previous years for me. Up until this year, I don't know that I had thought all that much about labor in any sort of meaningful way. This year, however, I thought about labor from so many different angles that it feels a little bit dizzying. As I was alone on the farm for the bulk of the last 19 months, the labor of heating the house with wood, of bringing hay and buckets of feed to animals in snow, rain, and shine, of cooking my own meals and cleaning them up, everything fell to me. I felt the impact of my labor for things that are easy for us to take for granted in the modern world, whether that's flipping a switch on for heat and all the copper and sand and wood and energy to burn it requires, or whether it's the food that we pick up at the grocery store and we don't feel the impact of that daily walk to deliver hay, to deliver feed. I felt these impacts in my body and my mind, and I thought a lot about that as my labor. At the same time, we explored labor through the lens of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the death of American manufacturing with both Rachel Slade and Stephen Kuritz. We explored labor through the lens of NAFTA's impacts in Mexico and how it changed labor in both Mexico and the United States and changed the cultural fabric and the dietary and culinary fabric of Mexico with Alicia Galvez. We also talked about unions, something I had scarcely considered, especially because I still don't know anyone in a union, despite the fact that about 50 years ago, around 1 in 3 Americans was part of one. Labor. Yes, labor. I dove into the etymology dictionary online, and I'm going to read the bulk of this entry for labor, which we're going to start with the noun form. And around 1300, this presents as a task, a project, such as the labors of Hercules. Later, it becomes an exertion of the body, trouble, difficulty, hardship. And by the late 14th century, in the old French of labor to toil, work, exertion, task, tribulation, suffering, or from the Latin labor to toil, exertion, hardship, pain, fatigue, a work, a product of labor. Some sources venture that it could be related to labor, to totter, on the notion of tottering under a burden. And certain people find this unconvincing. But this is also the body of laborers considered as a class, usually contrasted to capitalists, which we see emerge around the time of the Industrial Revolution, especially in Britain. There's also the physical exertions of childbirth, which comes from the 1590s, the labor of birth. And Labor Day itself was first marked in 1882 in New York City. There's also labor to the verb, which is to perform manual or physical work, to work hard, to keep busy, to take pains, to strive, to endeavor. It's also to plow land, which I think is very interesting and something that we're going to come back to. The verb in modern French, Spanish, and Portuguese means to plow. And so there's also labor, the verb to endure pain or suffering, to be burdened with trouble, with affliction. And while I don't want to belabor the point, I mean, you can't make this shit up, right? Our toil, our burden, the way we totter under a burden, the way we break the soil open by plow, never to heal in quite the same way. These definitions are important. You might be wondering where this is going, what this could possibly be leading into. And so I poured a lot of work, or labor, if you will, into the preparations for the guests that we have on the podcast today. I think that some of her books should absolutely be required reading for all of us. They are the absolute synthesis of so many of the ideas that we have explored here on the podcast. And I want you to know that I ran through the setup of this interview time and again prior to recording and was so excited to finally have the opportunity to talk with our guest. And then something happened. For one reason or another, I think that maybe her and I just didn't have much chemistry, or maybe we missed one another a little bit in the way that we think about things. And I know that at times I'm not as good of an interviewer with hard-ended questions as I am a conversationalist. And I've reflected a lot on this after this interview because at the time I had about 100 interviews under my belt. And while I don't think I'm an expert, I do know that I have a certain amount of nervous comfort in this space. I also think that it is my job as the host of this podcast to create a container for my guests' work to really sing and for the conversation to flow. And I feel like maybe I failed at that. I debated heartily whether or not I should release this episode, whether or not I should draw attention to my failure, with my biggest concern being that I would draw some sort of negative attention to our guest. At the end, though, I think I really wanted to be honest and I wanted to show this side of podcasting. And I also wanted the opportunity as the host to tell you a little bit about what I had envisioned for this episode and where it does fall in our explorations of supply chains, resource extraction, and human health. In retrospect, I wonder if I held too fast to my vision, right? That I had all of these expectations of how this might fit into what we had already been exploring. It's always been my intention to come to the conversations on this podcast with a potential story arc and structure, but to be really present to the conversation that shows up that day between two people. I felt like I was open to what was present, but maybe I was holding too tightly. Either way, dear listener, I do want you to hear a little bit of the genius of this woman's work in this particular realm, and you'll hear lots of the genius of her work directly from her mouth, which is even better. But I do want to show how it fits with some of the larger themes we've been exploring before we dive into the episode itself, which is full of all kinds of gems around community and movement. I want to issue my sincere apologies, both to our guests our guest for perhaps not being the right container for this particular conversation, and also to you. I think that there's a deep sense of wanting to be accountable to you, the listener, and the time that you invest in this podcast. And I hope that this little bit of honesty is the right move, because ultimately, the podcast is a lot like any blind date. It's a little bit of preparation and a lot of chemistry, especially in these conversations that are from cold. Moreover, and I want to say this, I really believe in showing process, and not quite finding the right cadence in a conversation is sometimes part of all of our process. With that being said, there is still so much good stuff in here. And so let me share a little bit in the intro, and then we will dive into this interview with Katy Bowman, who is our guest today and whose work has absolutely transformed me. I had that sensation in reading and actually predominantly listening to her work while I walked and hiked and labored on the farm, where it feels like you are having epiphany after epiphany. When you find someone who is so good at making sense of complexity and weaving it together in an easy to understand and digest format, that is the good stuff. And Katy's grasp of biomechanics seems to extend into the mechanics of the forces that make us human, both those from a long time past and the influences that shaped our very biology and morphology, but also the mechanics of the present on both a micro and macro scale, and how they shape not just our bodies, but also the bodies of others. This woman can talk about easing foot pain or creating a better movement plan or squatting, as well as she can talk about how movements in our daily lives affect the movements of others elsewhere in a greater economy of both care and movement. She can talk about movement itself as a commodity. In her words, one we once exchanged directly for food. In fact, one of the many tidbits of Katy's that keeps rattling around in my brain is that the cue for hunger is also a cue for movement. Because in times long before these, food procurement, in light of hunger, meant that you had to get out there and move. You've heard me repeat on this podcast as we've explored resources that we once moved our bodies to resources, whether that was food or water, shelter, fuel for fire. And now we move resources to our bodies. And the implications of that shift are complex, massive, and everywhere, and been a big part of what we've been exploring on the podcast. We have outsourced all that movement. To add to this, Katy reminds us that convenience is not so much about saving time, but about reducing movement. I'm just going to let that sit for a moment and consider all the conveniences in our daily lives. The quote that really ties this together for me is in Katy's book, Movement Matters: Essays on Movement Science, Movement Ecology, and the Nature of Movement, which I truly believe should be required reading for every human, and to this day is perhaps the most impactful book I've ever read. The quote that I keep coming back to is where Katy says that, quote, "Our daily life is composed of a lot of seemingly innocuous ways we've outsourced our body's work. One of the reasons I've begun focusing just as much on non-exercisey movements as I do on exercise-type movements is that I feel that the 10,000 outsourcings a day during the 23/24ths of your time hold the most potential for radical change. Be on the lookout for these things. To avoid the movements necessary to walk around to all the car doors, or just to avoid turning your wrist, or to avoid gathering your tea strainer and dumping the leaves and cleaning the strainer in your dishwasher, you have accepted a handful of garbage, plastic, which goes to a future landfill, and a battery. To avoid the simplest movements, you have, without realizing it, required other humans somewhere else in the world to labor endlessly, destroy ecosystems, and wage war for your convenience. Sedentarism is very much linked to consumerism, materialism, colonialism, and the destruction of the planet. If you're not moving, someone else is moving for you, either directly or indirectly, by making stuff to make not moving easier on you." In many ways, this quote became a guiding force for some of our explorations. You may have even heard me read this quote back to Deb Chakra when we explored infrastructure on her episode. I thought about it a great deal in our explorations around NAFTA and also shipping with Rose George. All the hands that move our goods to us in one way or another. It's also the environment, not just hands. It is the unseen cost to people and to soil. In one of the essays in Movement Matters, someone asked about the impacts of going off trail when hiking or doing what I have, through Katy, learned to call overground walking. Katy responds with something that I've thought about, I truly think, about 3 times a week since reading it almost a year ago. She says, quote, "Whether or not we stray off a trail or pick up a stick while in the woods, we leave more than a trace on wilderness all day long. Our traces are all the terribly made clothes in our closet that we buy weekly because we like new clothes. And I'm not even going into the sociological impact of supporting sweatshop sphere because other humans seem to fall outside of nature. So, and the plastic water bottles and paper cups we buy and toss multiple times a day. They're the bulk discount meat we buy cheap or the hamburgers we drive through to order. I made healthy smoothies from coconut milk for years without being aware that it contained seaweed. In fact, a lot of things most people use daily, like cosmetics and shampoo and industrialized beef, utilize seaweed, a vital habitat and nourishment to marine life. Our traces are the fuel necessary to get lanolin pulled from sheep's wool to process it into vitamin D for our fortified milk or orange juice because we spend so much time inside. They're the plastic toys for sale in the national parks made possible by destroying nature elsewhere to remind you of that time you went into nature and it was gorgeous, wasn't it?" She goes on to say, "I can definitely see how a lot of people going off path in a nature preserve would result in the destruction of a small area. It's definitely a capacity issue. But is it too many people, or is it just that we have such a small area allotted for human nature interactions? Maybe it's that the bulk of us, even the conservation minded, prefer to be sedentary and inside. The nature destroyed daily for our comfortable, sedentary lifestyle is staggering. At every turn, our comfort and lack of movement are the issues that, if we each choose to address them alongside better stewardship, can bring about radical improvement for nature and all its animals, including humans." End quote. In Katy's work, I found a call back to the movement of my life. I found something vitally important, which is why I labor. To come back to this question that I asked in this newsletter that I wrote. I know that at the beginning I pitted the etymology of labor with a certain amount of toil, of burden. And when I reflect on my last year of tending food for myself and heat for myself, those things are present. It at times felt like a slog, a toil, a burden. But there is also a joy and a connection in moving for yourself, in eschewing some of these conveniences. And I want to be so crystal clear in this. This isn't a judgment or a prescription on or for anyone. I realize that the labor that I choose, right, that I have chosen, and I had to remind myself time and time again, as I farmer carried 5-gallon buckets to feed chickens, that this is a choice that I am making. But I realized that that choice is something that I have made for myself for so many different reasons. It's about my environmental impact, yes, and about the impact I have on people I might never meet, yes, but it's also for me about a lifestyle that I largely enjoy. And I had to come back and really explore whether or not that was the case this last year. Is this something I enjoy? Why am I choosing this choice? And whatever I came to, and I'm not sure I've fully fleshed that answer out for myself. I'm so grateful to have had the experience of what it means to move more, to labor more for my efforts in this world. Because I think that oftentimes, and now, and you want to be really honest about process, I'm full off script now. Oftentimes we don't see all of these machinations, all of these movements of land and water and bodies that underlie the daily processes of our lives. And it is almost magic that we can flip a switch and light, like sun, just turns on inside of a room, or we can turn the thermostat up and down to make ourselves more comfortable without seeing all of the current of electricity, the energy that's generated at a power plant through wood or coal or oil or nuclear energy, which is tended by all these other resources, whether it's concrete or plutonium or various mining endeavors or forestry. So much of this underlies our daily activities and we don't see it. And I want to be clear that when you turn on that X-ray vision, and it is kind of like that, right? To be able to hold something in your hand and imagine the chain of supply, the hands, the lands that made the thing that you are touching, holding, flipping. And it can exhaust you. And so I think that it is a real gift to see this, and we can't get absolutely lost in it, but we can begin to think about those 23/24ths, as Katy says, of our time and all of the different movements that they require. And I'm going to come back to a quote of hers from Movement Matters again, where she says, and quote, "Our historical outsourcing of movement over and over again for hundreds of years has led us to where we are right now with respect to the amount of movement you and I need to do in order to eat. Where once we spent hours each day exchanging the movements involved in walking, running, bending, squatting, carrying, pounding, rubbing, lifting, digging, and mashing for a day's worth of calories, we spend almost no movement and lots of money on fuel to drive to a store and wander the aisles to buy overly packaged food, foraged, planted, picked, dug, processed, and flown or driven there by other people." End quote. She goes on to talk about even the act of mastication in many ways has been outsourced to the ways that we mechanically break down and process our food, changing the very shapes of our jaw and face and mouth. And so this has big implications at pretty much every level for ourselves and our bodies, for others and their bodies, for lands, for waters, for the environment. All of these different things are impacted. And it's in that I feel like Katy Bowman is the absolute master synthesizer of having us look at what it is to be human in this moment in time. And it is about our sedentarism, yes, but it is also about our interconnectedness to our environment, both near and far. And so it is with that I want to introduce the bulk of our conversation, where we talk about her new book release, which is called My Perfect Movement Plan. And it is a workbook that coincides with all of the work that she has done. And I actually ventured to fill out the workbook. And a big part of why I move is some of what I talked about here today. And I think that really links back to, what do I labor for? What am I for? What is this movement for? And for me, it was so much about the environment and these people that I may not know, but it was also about for my longevity of movement, that I want to be moving like this when I'm 80. And it was in service to that, and in service to joy and connection for me. So I hope that you can find your perfect movement plan. And I hope that you can begin to dig into why movement matters. And I hope that you will pick up any number of Katy's incredible books. If you are looking to address anything like foot pain, she is incredible for it. But if you just want to think about the bigger picture, she's incredible for that too. I just want you to know that I am so excited to bring you this episode supported by Sundries Farm Garlic and Redmond Real Salt. If you're enjoying the podcast, if you can just hit subscribe to keep up with future episodes, and if you feel like moving your thumbs a little bit, leave a rating and review wherever you listen. It might feel like a small movement, but it leaves a big impact in helping others find the podcast and supporting my mission to lay the groundwork for our future. I'm so grateful for your listening, and I cannot wait for you to hear this episode with Katy Bowman about her new book, My Perfect Movement Plan, and to just dive in with you. So here she is. Bit of background about hi. I mean, first of all, it is just such a pleasure. You've come up on so many previous podcasts and been a little anchor in some of the quotes from particularly Movement Matters, but some of your ideas have already been woven into the podcast. And so it's really an honor to have you here.
Thank you.
I've been exploring this thesis. I want to give you this little piece of background. I had this thesis statement before I read Movement Matters, and then it sort of changed my life to read that book. And my thesis statement was that we used to move our bodies to resources, and our waste was part of the circular economy of the cycles of Earth. And now we move resources to our bodies. And we've explored a lot about the resources we used to move our bodies to, the resources we now move to our bodies, and the movement of those now resources, which is shipping and trucking. Mm-hmm. And we've looked at roads and sand and phosphorus and fertilizers and salts. But we haven't looked at the movement of our own bodies to resources. And so much of your work really brought that together for me in just how much has changed in that distinction, which is what we're kind of exploring on the podcast anyway.
Yeah, great. I'm looking forward to talking about that.
Yeah, I thought maybe we might start with outsourcing, because so much of Movement Matters was about outsourcing, and I got a little bit curious about this before this episode. The word outsourcing doesn't actually enter the lexicon until 1981. It's a neologism. I always struggle with this word. It's a neologism of outside and resources. And we've explored a lot of the sort of geopolitical and policy machinations that brought us to that point in 1981, and how much changes in terms of American manufacturing. And we've also explored a lot about how much changes around the dawn of agriculture, being a farmer. And I just thought it was really interesting that that was a relatively new term. And so I wanted to kick that to you to kind of start this off.
Like,
yeah.
Sorry, what's the question?
There wasn't really a question, and I can kind of reframe. I often just talk let me kind of start this. So much of Movement Matters is about the way in which we have outsourced our movement to other people in different places, that we've outsourced our movement of every day in a way that has an effect on our planetary resources and on humans we can't see, and that has an effect too on our bodies and our local communities, as well as the ones writ large. And so I think my question in here is, how do you think of outsourcing? How do you think of outsourcing movement? And to kind of begin to give us a framework for this.
Well, I think that you and I probably are approaching the same idea from different directions. You're starting with, well, let me say that a different way. You and I are probably seeing the effects of outsourcing differently. You're looking at the geopolitical, the global effects.
And the environmental.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's maybe your point of worry or wanting to give attention. And then in trying to solve those problems, you've come to understand outsourcing to be a contributing, maybe primary contributing factor. for me, I was trying to solve the problem of why are people suffering in their bodies? And the idea of outsourcing, I don't really see that I don't see that I've oh, sorry, let me say this again. I don't know if I've seen anyone else in the body realms field, whether it's medicine or, physical therapy or public health, talk about outsourcing in the same way that someone approaching these larger environmental or geopolitical issues, like we're using the same definition. It's us not doing the movement for the
Yeah.
things that we consume. And I got to that point after 20 years of trying to help people figure out how to move their body, move their body in ways that better nourish their own bodies. And then after studying movement, enough years, I was like, oh, I have to really understand sedentarism. What, we use sedentarism, this term, all the time, but we don't talk about why the sedentarism. I mean, certainly the
Yeah.
idea of comfort and ease, but that idea of comfort and ease is always there. But it's like, well, how are we able to be so
Mm.
comfortable and so labor free? How are so many of us able to be in this situation of being labor free when labor and resources have always been intertwined, have
Yes.
always been the same axis of life and axis of culture.
Yes.
Both of those things have always been um, woven until now we're starting to separate the fibers of this very long rope that stretches back very far. So it was in trying to understand sedentarism that I was like, oh, it's outsourcing. Okay, got it. And so that's how I'm sure how I ended up on this podcast, like because it's another arm. I feel it's another arm to how, I assume that you're probably not as much interested in the machinations of or the mechanisms as much as you are trying to stop the thing from happening. You know what I mean? Like one's an academic exercise or a theoretical
Hmm.
exercise, like that an academic would be like, I'm just interested in knowing how it works. And then
Yeah.
there's coming to figure out how it works because you're interested in contributing to solve the issue. And so, yeah, you tell me.
I hope you're enjoying this interview with Katy Bowman. When I think about my own movement and those things I reach for on a daily basis, I actually think about salt. Salt is a critical component of what allows our muscles to contract, moving us around our daily lives. I'm committed to sourcing things well, committed to movement, and committed to incredible ingredients, which is why I use Redmond Real Salt. Their mission aligns with mine in every way possible. Mined from an ancient seabed right in Utah, Redmond Real Salt is packed full of 60 plus trace minerals that support my movement, and I really love that it is mined right here in America, in Utah, with the most incredible team of humans. Everyone, these people are amazing. They fuel my movement in two really big ways. The first is with their table salt, which I actually buy in bulk 10-pound bags so that I can use it in a variety of different ways, and I always have some, as well as their Relight hydration powder, which is my favorite for days that include a lot of movement that leaves me pretty sweaty and in need of replenishing my electrolytes and, if you will, relighting my life. Right now, I'm obsessed with the mango flavor. Speaking of flavorful, salt is a big part of what brings out the flavor in life. Whether you're canning the spoils of summer, just cooking dinner, or adding a pinch to water on a hot day, Redmond is my go to. It adds a flavor that's earthy and a touch sweet, and I love that I'm getting all of those minerals that have been protected from pollutants since they're mined from an ancient seabed. You can get 15% off and support your movement and this podcast and Salt Mind Right in America by getting either Redmond Real Salt or their Relight electrolyte powder by going to redmond.life and using the code mindbodysoil_15, or you can just hit the link in the show notes. Again, that's the code mindbodysoil_15 for 15% off. Such a great deal when you go to redmond.life or hit the link in the show notes. Now, back to our interview. I think it's both. I really do think it's both. One of the things that I hold close on this podcast is a David Graeber quote, and it goes something like, "The ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it's something we've made and could just as easily make differently." And I'm always trying to explore both sides, like how was this made? And that includes how is our modern human body made and some of the biases we see when we look at the modern human body, especially through the lens of science and picking it apart into parts, which you talk about so beautifully, and looking at the last 100,000, 200,000 million years of human history and what those bodies were doing, how they were moving.
Mhm.
And then there's this piece around reimagining. It's kind of a catch-all. And I came to this through movement, through considering how agriculture changed our movement, and then through participating in a lot of the movements of agriculture. I thought this morning about all the 5-gallon buckets I pick up, all the, times I squat and bend to I fed a little bottle baby goat, and what that involves just to feed myself, which is all I really do. I raise all of my own meat and milk products. And so I think it's a little bit of everything. And I think that you said something really beautiful, which is, this separation of labor and movement, and the separation of all of these stacked parts that used to be the whole of our context, how we are woven into the world, is now something that has been broken apart.
Yep. And people are, I mean, on my end of things, people are maybe not interested. It's not that they're not interested. They're not necessarily coming to me or my books because they were interested in these concepts that you're talking about. Certainly there are some now. They're more like, how do I deal with repairing my body in some way? Or why is this happening to my body? There is always going to be physical degeneration over time, but we're in an accelerated degenerative rate right
Yes.
now. And to be able to explain movement as a nutrient, it's not, even though we live in a time and a place where we can't outsource our need for it. So we have this paradox where culturally right now, some of us are able to outsource, but the requirement still dwells within the body. So what do you do in this scenario? What is our relationship to labor? Why is it this way? How much of it is a natural, like the aversion? I don't want to say it's an aversion to labor. The tendency to step away from labor whenever possible is equally in our nature as is our need for movement. And so that's kind of the issue that we have, is we are actually behaving naturally, if we want to use that word really casually, right? We're behaving as in our blueprint of our DNA. We're tinkerers. Humans are tinkerers. And then as we've tinkered and influenced and been able to create environments that allow us to be more comfortable, i.e., doing less labor, we're going to take them until we'll probably have to rationalize our way, out of that. Like, that's what we're doing, right? We're providing an argument to say, like, here's where you might want to make some different changes because your body still needs you to move. And so that's my interest really in all of this.
Yeah. And I think that that's a really, a couple of things. I think that I think that there are a lot of beautiful doorways to understanding our world. And I think that asking why, my left hip hurts when I do X is a really beautiful doorway into
Mhm.
understanding something about your body and then understanding your body in the context of the movements that it's doing and the environments that have made those movements. And, there's this other piece here that's exploring, the word natural is a sticky word. I think we both know that.
Mhm.
But exploring this idea of the sort of built world that we have built and how it has changed and shifted the movements of our bodies towards convenience. And something that you said that really struck me, and I think this is in my perfect movement plan, is that convenience is not about saving time but reducing movement.
Mhm.
And that really struck me. And so that this is a natural response of humans to reduce movement. And movement is a nutrient, both a micronutrient and a macronutrient, that we very much need, and we need a wide variety of it. And when we give up these things, you had a really beautiful example either in Movement Matters or my perfect movement plan, to technology. When we put our clothes in a dryer, for example, instead of hanging them to create more time, maybe to move differently, we're
Mhm.
sacrificing some of the very diverse array of movements that our body craves, a sort of nutrient density, as you've called it.
I think that the concept of outsourcing is a spectrum in the same way that technology is a spectrum. And I don't think spectrum is maybe the right word here, but what I mean is when we talk about technology, what we tend to go to is like computers, phones, things with engines or
Mhm.
motors, electrical. But a backpack is a technology,
Very
right?
much so.
A hatchet made out of um, metal and whittled wood is a technology. The
Yeah.
first stone tied to a stick to become a mallet was a
Big
technology.
technology.
Right.
Fermentation is a technology.
They're technologies, right?
Yeah.
So outsourcing, I would say, is along those lines as well, right? So when we talk
Mm.
about outsourcing, we have to understand maybe the origins of outsourcing. And so if you think about original communities of people, everyone wasn't doing exactly the same thing. And this isn't a human phenomenon. These are, ants, right?
Yep.
They have designated work. And so are we going to say that the worker bee is outsourcing um, making more bees to the queen? You know what I mean? Like there's a spectrum in which we can look at communities that have said, hey, I'll do the fishing and you do the berries and we'll come together and share. So
Mhm.
I'm always really interested in the
Hmm.
nuance of words because I think the nuance of the concept often are blocked from us by the words that we choose to use. So
Yeah.
are you outsourcing the drying of the clothes to the dryer when you could hang them instead? So that concept of putting them in the dryer instead of hanging them was maybe a way of being able to do more labor, different labor. Like I don't think that habit of outsourcing or the taking of the convenience was even about avoiding labor. It was about being able to do more labor, different
Yes.
labors. But when you get maybe saturated in conveniences, then the idea was, I remember talking about this with a, a host of some show somewhere, and he was like, I thought that when we were outsourcing, the idea was so that we could go then move our bodies like in a way that nourished us. I'm like, I think that that's sort of the theoretical idea. It's like I would rather be doing other movement than
Mhm.
hanging my laundry. And fair enough, like so would I.
Me
But
too.
what we yeah, right, right. But I think that what we tend to see is people aren't stepping to movements that they prefer.
Yes.
Certainly not at the volume. So there is a loss of volume. And then when you go to what you prefer, there tends to be a loss in diversity of the movements that you get. There's something about the categories of labor that humans have to do because it's what shaped our body, that it's also what nourishes our body. So when you start to pick and choose, you're like, well, why can't I only just, cycle 40 miles today to meet my movement needs instead of, walk around and feed my animals or, do my laundry or, carry my kid from point A to point B. That's not my dream movement workout scenario. I want a Zumba, for hours because it makes me feel good. So all of that is complex. And I think my laser through all of that is to say, it's not just movement that we need. It's the subtle bends in all of the different places. It's, again, I use the word diversity and distribution. It's that your movement is distributed well all over your parts. And the shapes that you are using need to really diversify. And it's not to say that you couldn't completely outsource all of your labor and then replace a day's worth of labor with exercises that mimic bending over, carrying things from, there's farmer carries that are just an exercise.
Yes.
Like, I'm going to carry this stand-in weight across the fake field, which is this building, and then set it down and then turn around and do it again. Like, we're at the point where we're resynthesizing these movements. And I'm sort of I'm really bent towards the concept of efficiency. And I'm like, this is really inefficient. Like, what you've got is this mega structure where the structure is so big so everyone can step into a single room for 1 minute instead of making a smaller structure where everyone can, utilize a room for half of a day. And so, and when I think of economics, I think of the expense of the structure itself, of building the structure, of running the structure, and then of the wasted time going from room to room, trying to meet all your needs 1 minute at a time in this like Winchester Mystery House, which most people won't get that reference unless you're from California, which is this house that was just slapshod. They just kept adding rooms and staircases and doors. That's like, you can't live here, right? Like, it's such an inefficient dwelling. And I think our dwelling, our metaphorical dwelling, but sometimes our literal dwellings have become very inefficient in this way. And then time is the biggest barrier to meeting all of our needs. So we're no longer meeting our needs.
As you're listening to this episode and thinking about your movement why, one of my favorite things to do is to support the hands and body that move for my food and to really know them. That's part of why I'm so grateful to have the joyful and hardworking hands over at Sundries Farm Garlic supporting this podcast. Rob Kropfel, who has been a guest on this show, and Jillian Lakuski are two of the hardest workers I know, and they are also just so full of joy, and I think all of that comes through in their garlic. Their garlic has these big cloves, which they've selected over the years so that they're easy to peel and delicious and efficient in your kitchen, and they are certified white rot free by the state of Idaho. They're grown without herbicides or pesticides and with the most thoughtful soil management practices. Sundries Farm Garlic is perfect for both seed and culinary garlic needs, and it is that time of year, folks. If you are planting garlic, the time is about upon us, and if you're stocking your pantry, it's that time too. So, whether you're looking for seed or culinary garlic, Sundries Farm has you covered with hard and soft neck varietals like Music and Chestnut Red and Purple Glazer. I have been digging into this braid of Purple Glazer that's in my pantry, and I just can't get over how beautiful and delicious it is. This garlic is so packed full of flavor. It is earthy and spicy and piquant, and it just makes all of my dishes sing. Sundries Farm Garlic is available for shipping now. Explore a wide range of varietals and grab bags for planting and culinary needs by going to sundriesfarm.com. That's SUNDRIESFARM.com to Order your seed and culinary garlic for the year, and shipping has begun. You don't need a code, just have your hankering for some incredible hand-grown garlic ready and in action. Now, back to our interview. I love all of that. And I want to pick on something first before we dive deeper into it, which is the concept of efficiency. We were talking about words and nuances, and this has come up a lot on the podcast lately, the idea of efficiency. And it's been repeated a couple of times through the lens of the efficiency of moving water through an irrigation ditch versus a stream. And so an irrigation ditch, and this doesn't even speak to where water comes from and all of that, but an irrigation ditch is going to get water from point A to point B. We might see it as being very efficient in that it's a straight line, it's delivering the water, it has whatever outcroppings it needs to get it into whatever field it needs to go into. It's made of concrete, and so you're losing less water to absorption, but you're also losing it to evaporation. Whereas a stream is not straight. It doesn't go directly from point A to point B. And within the context of a stream are all these little eddies and outcroppings and pools, places where it moves faster or slower. And those are where life happens. That's where diversity happens. That's where nourishment of an ecosystem of a lot of different pieces comes in. And so, as you're talking about the way in which we have built our world to be more efficient, and yet are finding that it is not actually nourishing us in the way that we've expected, to me, there's a lot in the way that we have built our world like a flat line when our world is a sine wave, when what we need is a sine wave. We need the peaks and the valleys and the little spaces where a little mink is building a home next to an eddy, or where a beaver completely changes the trajectory of a river. And I think within that is this sort of paradox that you bring up in my perfect movement plan, where not only are we more sedentary than ever before, we're also less rested. We have more options for movement, at least here. And yet we're still more sedentary, this rise of technology, of convenience, and still sedentarism. And so a little piece there about efficiency that I think, I hope makes sense.
No, I hear that. And I think that what makes efficiency tricky is everyone's using the word relative to the outcome that they were hoping for. So for what I hear for you is your concept of efficiency is more than to a crop yield, or more than how many humans will be fed by the crop yield. Your sense of efficiency has to do with the things that live in the river, right? Like you're managing ecosystems or eddies in the water. Like the eddies in the river might have nothing to do with the crop yield, and that's why they're not considered in the formula for efficiency for moving water, into agriculture.
Yes, but I also think just that that they're providing a place for nutrient density, for life to proliferate, for communities to crop up, for something, for something beyond just yield.
You mean
Yes.
other humans to live along the river?
I mean everything. I mean other animals other than humans, also an animal. I think other humans, other things that we might not know or understand, right? That there's a context within a river of life, and that the irrigation ditch doesn't allow for life to happen, for diversity to occur. I think I'm thinking about it also in terms of biodiversity.
Yeah.
And maybe it wasn't the right analogy.
No, I think the analogy is beautiful. I guess I think the person who would argue that the irrigation ditch was efficient might be looking at a different set of values or a different valuation system than someone who would be looking to also see, like, I don't think life flourishing in the rivers might be on the efficiency checklist for someone arguing for the efficiency of the irrigation ditch. It's got a
Absolutely.
different goal. It's got a completely different
Absolutely.
goal.
Sure.
So I think with efficiency, and this crops up with movement too. This crops up when we talk about, I just use puns, right? Like for agricultural movement, like I often will be guiding folks who are food producers, whether it's farmers or gardeners, usually farmers, because there's a higher yield that needs to happen. So there's a greater need for efficiency when I would say growing is your work versus growing is your hobby, where you're like, it doesn't matter if this crop in my backyard
Absolutely.
garden,
Yeah.
so I will be giving guidelines to say you have to be considering your body in this equation. Like, it's very inefficient if you've trashed your body in the first 6 years of your farming journey to where you can't do it any longer. That's
Absolutely.
inefficient if you're going to put the farmer's body and needing to maintain that piece of equipment into the formula of whether or not setting up your farm in a certain way is sustainable or is lucrative, right? Like if you have to replace a farmer, it stops being lucrative.
Yeah. Yes.
But so I'll say things like, you want to vary what you're growing a little bit in terms of body use. Like if you only grew strawberries, say, the way you have to use your body is going to match. Like if you think there's a monocrop, there's a mono movement shape or use for that crop. I mean, certainly it's different stages. It might vary
Yes.
a little bit, but if you have an olive orchard, that's going to be a different set of movements. But when you are not approaching it, your production in terms of monocropping, but you're building a food forest, or you're doing permaculture to the extent that you're considering the shapes that your body is making as part of that ecosystem. A big outcry is like, that's inefficient. If I have to keep switching my shape, if I have to keep switching my tools, if I have to keep switching gears to tend to these different plants that I'm growing, that's time lost. So for me, I would say, well, I've got your body as part of the model that I'm considering for efficiency, where your model for efficiency is yield at the end of the day. It doesn't matter if your body can't do the things. You're not adding surgeries or other things that you have to deal with pain in your body. So it's really what you are considering when you are discussing efficiency that matters, so that you're not having two different conversations.
Yeah. I absolutely. And I think that again is kind of coming back to that idea of context and looking at it within somebody's context. And I think that this is something we come back to a lot in agriculture. And I even pulled, right? Context to me is a lot about the idea of weaving together, and it's weaving together all these factors and relationships that make up our bodies as they move through this world, and the other bodies that they are connected to, and that includes, to me, plant bodies and animal bodies, and the way that we are tending or stewarding, whether that's our land or our kids or just ourselves, whatever that is, that context matters. And I think that's something that you do a really beautiful job of, sort of building this ecological model of our bodies, and these sort of expanding outward in the context that they're in. First looking at our relationship to ourselves, and then our communities in a smaller context, and then communities in a broader context. And so I think that's something that is definitely needed, and to think about the context of etymology of that. One of the guiding quotes has been how sedentarism is linked to consumerism and materialism, and I have a great piece from you that's come up on the podcast, but let's kind of shift into talking some about movement and micronutrients and macronutrients of that movement and a diversity of movement. And maybe if our conversation leads there, we can go there.
Okay. That sounds great.
Yeah. So I think let's talk some about what it means to bring a diversity. You know, we were talking some about having a monoculture of movement. And this is something that I notice even just within my own movement and the movements that I choose. And again, it's so interesting to be in a situation where we're selecting our movements as opposed to having these sort of outside forces of needing to move our bodies to things. And so getting a little bit of a broader range, or being in a situation where our labor has us doing a very repetitive movement and what it might mean to diversify those movements.
Well, I talk about a movement diet, and how you can look at, I think for many people looking at their movement diet tend to have a caloric approach. Like, am I moving enough? Like, what's my total volume of movement? Because we are sort of in a movement drought, if you will. People are struggling just to get movement calories, is what I call them, just units of movement. And that's where we've been striving, because it's dwindling, right? It's dwindling culturally.
Yeah.
Whether it's it's the demand of work time that we're under now, just economically, whether it's like we have it alongside with so much development seems to be like many more options for activities. Like everything just keeps growing and filling in the cracks of rest or space. And so that pressure is forcing us to make choices every day of where we're going to put our time, and movement is absolutely a need, like sleep and dietary nutrition and movement, time with others, connection, interpersonal relationships, education. And I just mean like personal development, learning. These are all needs. Rest. I said sleep already. These are
But
needs.
also rest. Also rest outside of sleep.
Sleep is a subcategory of rest.
You
It
do
is one way we rest, but it's not the only. It's not like sort of like grind and then pass out and sleep. There needs to be like attentional rest. Rest where you're awake and you're present, but you're not necessarily cramming your mind with something. Attentional rest is what I call it. And so we've got this movement calorie issue, but there are other needs. Our body depends on more things for movement than just calories. So I use the movement nutrition as, I use a dietary nutrition as a framework for movement nutrition, because we know that it's not just that we eat enough calories. What's in the calories is really equally important in terms of like what are the macronutrients that are in those calories and what are the micronutrients that are in those calories. So we can think about movement in the same way. If I look at my time spent moving or my movement calories, I want to see what macro categories are showing up within those movements. And I, as a biomechanist, I use shape, because shape is really important to how our bodies are nourished from movement. So like, what shapes are you using through the day, to make sure that it's not just shapes, it's also efforts in the shapes. It's a little nuanced here. So you want to have shapes and you want to have different efforts in those shapes. And then micronutrients, which are of course found in macronutrients and found in calories, just like in the dietary model, is how are all of your fine parts moving? That's the vitamins and minerals of movement. Is your movement diet distributed well through all of your parts? And so there's one, if you're familiar at all with the idea of cross training, it's like, are my hands or my shoulders involved in this exercise? Is it mostly through my core, through my spine? Are my legs involved? Am I on my feet? Am I sitting down? Like, we're used to thinking about that, but there's a lot of nooks and crannies in the body. And because we have shared a shared culture, a shared broad culture, our micro cultures might be different, but we have a shared broader culture. There tends to be a lot of positional and movement traits to that culture that we have in common. And those areas of movement malnourishment tend to show up in really predictable ailments across a culture that's got these shared movement characteristics. And so dialing in your movement micronutrients is also a really unused toolkit when it comes to health and
Yeah.
wellness, to tending to our body. So that's the way that I like to speak about movement. And then, of course, laying that overlay in the context of life, because I just said you needed to not only move more, but you need to hit these other categories and hit all these fine pieces. And you're like, oh my goodness, like, how am I going to do that with the 45 minutes that I've been able to figure out that movement fits in my life? Usually because we're thinking of exercise. And that's why this bigger perspective of the movement overlay to life is so important, because you cannot nourish your body with enough movement unless it's showing up in all the domains of your life, not just your leisure time domain.
Yeah.
And not just your labor domain, or not just your occupation domain either, because a
Yes.
lot of us will have highly repetitious, strenuous work. That's also not nourishing. It's also not
Yes.
nourishing.
I was really struck by that in both Move Your DNA and the workbook that you're just releasing, in that
Mhm.
we have these labor movements, but we need, and I think that we often fall victim to that. And I know that in the farming community, that is an easy, well, I move a lot during the day.
Of
There's a lot
course.
of steps, a lot
Of
of
course.
farmer carries. And so that it goes both ways, and it's about stacking functions too. And this is something that I really love that you do so beautifully, stacking functions in terms of, we do have less time and we have to choose where we put our time, is something that you said, and that when we're looking at the myriad of choices that we now have, and how we select for that time, that is kind of, you said, and I wrote this down, growing in the cracks of rest or space to just be, something I kind of call cud chewing, like to just sit, chew your cud, look very distantly and just be, right, a human being, not a human doing. And so what it means to kind of begin to stack some functions so we can get that nutrient density and those micronutrients in the different realms of our lives that we're moving throughout anyway. And so, in my perfect movement plan, you do a really good job of sort of asking everyone to look at, like, what are these movements that I am doing in labor, in leisure, in sleep? What are these shapes that I'm making? Which is something that I love, because I notice all the time the shapes I'm making and try to make less of the shrimp or croissant shape.
Mhm.
So do you want to talk a little bit more about kind of stacking some functions and bringing in this sense of diversity into movement?
Well, I think first, you listener, or we all would want to determine, are we high calories or low calories as far as movement goes? So, with the example that you give is someone who's like, I am already moving all day long or most of the day. Like, you're meeting your caloric requirement. And of course, some people can be on the end where they're not. Then you have to look at, okay, well, I'm already getting my movement requirements are already being met. If you're in that, I'll talk to the audience as if they're all on the higher end of movement calories. But you can have a high calorie diet and your macros and micros are not drilled in. So you have two options. You can either replace the task, or swap the task that you're doing, meaning stop doing certain things and start doing other things. Or sometimes you can just change the shape that you're making while you're doing the same task. And it's really helpful, I think, to discern between those two things. So, like, a task could be weeding. But you have a lot of different shapes available for weeding. You do not have to, and weeding might not be something that you can opt away from, let's say if you're gardening, but you probably have a way that you weed. Maybe you're bending over at the spine, maybe you're kneeling down. And when you plot out your movement diet, you can see like, oh yeah, I do see that I choose to make this one particular shape with this task that I'm doing. And so since this task is really a non-negotiable task, is the shape negotiable? And you can work in that way. And then your other option would be to swap tasks. You're talking about stacking, and stacking is a third option where that's looking for a single task that met needs currently being executed with 2 or more tasks. So if you need to get groceries, let's say, and you're going to drive to the grocery store, so you have the need for the groceries, but you also have a need for the walk. You can just walk to get the groceries. Yeah. And so you can pick a single task, and now you get your walk and you get your big body movement, your carrying done, and you got your groceries. So you're able to meet 2 needs, and then within the category of the shapes, you could even get your walking and your carrying done at that same time, 2 different macro categories, by just choosing to not drive and get your groceries or drive part way. And this is like, that could be how you pick up your kids. It could be how you reach out and connect with someone, like instead of going out to dinner or going out for coffee or meeting someone for drinks, you're going to suggest that you take something to go on foot. So you're going to get your friend connection time, but you also get some walking time. You also get some outside time. So the stacks keep coming, right? If you're getting community and you're getting nature while you're doing it. So it's the idea of first looking at what are my have-tos in my day, and then what are my needs that need to be met. So there's like have-tos and want-tos. Have-tos, we don't often put movement under the have-tos. It tends to be like paying bills or, so when you start to look at these biological imperatives that we have and put them into your model, right now, so much of our physicality sits outside of our models, sits outside of our efficiency models we already talked about. It sits outside of our to-do list. And I'm not even saying like schedule in like self-care, because I think that is sort of out there. Make sure you prioritize yourself. It's really more nuts and bolts. It's just, you're a tool. Like whatever else you're trying to do with your body, you're a tool, and it requires maintenance. And we're not taking very good care of our tools. Like we'll oil and wash and store properly these essential tools, but we don't really think or do any of that for our own bodies. And so it's me calling out like, this is a tool and this is what its care requires. And it has to be part of our scheduling models and our economic models as well.
Yeah, I really agree. And I think it's interesting. I don't know that we've ever had to consider care of our tools in the way that we might now. And so while we've talked about how maybe seeking out less movement as a means of ease, or all of the different movements that we made as a community to, bring our bodies to resources, and to break down those resources to put back into our bodies and to fuel our day, that we haven't had to consider care until this sort of sedentarism began to set in. That's not sort of a built-in place that I think the human mind goes, is, oh, how am I caring for my body? How is this that our bodies were cared for by being in the environments that they had evolved in many ways, that was the act of caring for our bodies. And that severing means adapting in this way where we consider how we're caring. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, I'm following you. I would just like, I don't know if I would say 100% that it's just through sedentarism that we've had to care for our bodies. I mean, I think of My great-grandparents were farmers here, and they were they were laborers. And I mean, we can definitely go back to even farther back.
Pre-agricultural is
Yeah.
more that's sort of the sort of space that our bodies were inculcated in.
Yeah. So, okay. So we can go back that far, but I think even at that time, I think that the level of care that bodies had at that stage would not meet our care standards now.
Mm.
I mean, certainly as far as movement goes, I think we would have more of our needs met. I tease this out. I can't remember where, if it's written down or not. Like, life was much harsher. Like, I guess I don't want to glorify this particular time. I
Yeah,
want to say that
no.
essentially, I think it met more needs. I
Yes.
think it met more needs. And so maybe I'm just being thrown off by the word care. Because when we do talk about self care, it's often like it feels more indulgent or relaxation, and it feels less about the nuts and bolts
Mm.
of um, what would have been nourishing. I agree with you. Back in that period of time, I think our needs would have been met better in general. Barring catastrophe or barring other things. Like I think a lot of where we are right now in the broader picture, um, in terms of, let's just say, this outsourcing framework that we've created,
Mhm.
is because our standard for living and how we feel in our bodies is so much higher.
Mm.
Like, I don't think we would be able to tolerate. I don't know how well we would tolerate. I mean, we're doing a podcast right now, right? Like, if you think about all of that, and I don't know if we would, in that exact same situation years ago, be like, look how much better I'm cared for right now. I don't think we would
Mm.
feel that way. I think that our needs would be met better, though. But
Mm.
the psyche that we have for what cared for is, and what we are used to or accustomed to, I don't know if it would rank as high for us now.
Mm. I think that's a great question. I think that's something that I
Mhm.
hadn't considered. I think oftentimes when I look backwards, one of the biggest things that I feel like was perhaps more present during that time that is less present now is a sense of community.
For
And
sure.
I think in that respect, when we're talking about all the movements we do, these movements, and you do a really good job of talking about this, and movement matters. And we kind of covered it at the beginning. These movements are shared across a community or even traded
Mhm.
between different communities. And so I think sometimes the way that I come at the idea of care is maybe through a sort of communal aspect
Mhm.
of sharing, and but I think that's a really fantastic question, and I do a lot of work not to over romanticize
Mhm.
any piece of history, or even, I think farming gets over romanticized a lot for many of the reasons that your work covers,
Yeah.
that it is hard on bodies in a way that I think people don't expect, and that it does reduce our time for those micronutrients of movement. And so I think that's a really good question of our standards now, and our, perhaps, I don't know, is it our awareness of our own bodies?
Yeah, I just, when you were saying that, it sort of unlocked a whole thread of, I have all these thoughts zinging around, and
Great.
now on an interview, in a conversation on a podcast, is not the best time to sort of synthesize them. But I also think, so I've lived in different parts of the world, and I agree. I mean, for me, community is really essential to movement ecology.
Mhm.
Um, and But there's a lot of intact community in the world. Like, it's not a modernity issue. I don't think it's a
Mm.
modernity issue. So I think that's the thing that's sticking with me, is I think that we are talking about a very specific culture that does not have access to community because maybe they don't have the skill set in developing it or maintaining it because it's been lost. Like if you follow your family line back, maybe it was lost. I mean, certainly when you're in a country of immigrants, there was a big sever of people from their cultures. That community, I think, is alive and well on the planet right now in many places. I do not think for probably those listening to the podcast, it's ripe. And so I just wouldn't want to confuse the period of time with that particular problem when I think it might be a specific culture and just a specific skill set that's lost because we have worked really hard here to develop that community that is, co-parenting, sharing resources, but it's taken without a lot of maybe role models in everyone's lineage. I feel like community can be intact, but I do think, to your bigger point, I think doing things in community absolutely meets more of our needs across the board.
Yeah.
But I think it's available now. I think a lot of what I'm trying to write about is like, here's how you develop some community in this way. But taking those steps is uncomfortable because not all of us have identified community in the same way we've maybe identified nature or movement or vitamin C. I really try to call it out. I'm like, this is a nutrient. Nutrients are nutrients are non-negotiable.
Yeah.
Like there will be a predictable set of outcomes in an absence of a nutrient. And so, we need more talk about community. We need more, whatever a dietitian is, like what is a dietitian equivalent to a community where you go in, you're like, I'd like you to assess my levels of community where someone's like, okay, well, I see and I think we actually are having those conversations, but they're showing up as teen anxiety.
Yeah.
Replacing friends, right? We're not calling it community. We're not filing it under that language, but I think it's actually happening right now. We are looking at what are the effects of slowly removing people from people in these different ways. But I'm all for, one of the reasons I like to bring movement to ecology and movement to these environmental and social models is because I think we're missing the bigger underlying biological factor that was always there and now suddenly isn't, instead of like, what could be causing this and trying to come up with these like nebulous answers. I'm like, there's a pretty big brick. There's a pretty big keystone that's not in this arch. Hey, let's just name that. And so community to me is another one, but we're not at the stage where we have really collective language around community. It's the same thing. Like we didn't have to talk about nutrients until we left this very niche environment that developed, in which our bodies are developing, and also our bodies are still developing as bodies moved away from these shared places. We develop different nutritional needs. We all don't have exactly the same nutritional needs.
No,
and it could be I believe that goes for movement as well, and it goes for community maybe a little bit too. We're in process. We're humans. We're living beings, animals in process, and I'm not here to say what we're going to end up being.
I think you explained something that I think we're all witnessing, right? Is that we don't have this shared language around community, and we're naming a lot of symptoms, right? We're talking a lot about teen social media, phone usage, things like that, and naming these symptoms, or in many ways, to bring this back, maybe I wonder if this resonates. These shapes that we are in, absent of community, and we're naming those shapes, but we're not naming community. And I want to say this really specifically. You do such a good job in all of your books of bringing it back to the skill set. And I love this. I think this is very important, that community is a skill set. And perhaps that is something that we have sort of lost intergenerationally, in the same way that, it's a knowledge. So way of doing life that we've lost, that we can begin to regain. And so much of your work is centered around both bringing these micronutrients to our individual bodies as we move more with and for and in concert with our communities.
Well, and I love the idea of the shape of a community. In Movement Matters, I use geese flying together as an example. Like, that's a shape. Like, when you look at that shape, you're like, oh, this is not just a bunch of it's not only a bunch of individual geese going from point A to point B. There's these delicate interactions. The positioning is all thoughtful. It's about allowing rest for some and leadership for others, and youth to participate in the group in the way that they can, and it's constantly swapping out, and that's a shape. And there's plenty of people who do research and studies on community. They're just not showing up maybe in the same space as in the health spaces necessarily. There's going to be more an anthropology of, like, look at how we used to be. There's a lot of language around used to, but I think that that's, it's like an ethnocentric perspective. I think we have an ethnocentric problem when we're looking at the world a lot of times. And so, yeah, like, if you, I just, now I wish I could expand this book that I just did that had you look at your shapes all day to be like, what's the shape of your community? Like, do you feel like there is a section, especially with Grow Wild, when you can plot that, it's like, how much of your day is with others or without? And I don't mean like on a subway you're with people, but that's not necessarily in community, to be really specific, to be with people that you belong to, that you feel belong to you. Like, how often are we in those spaces? And maybe your way of assessing your shape could just be looking at the domains of your life and be like, when am I with those people? And if it's almost never, then the shape, your bar graph, is looking at your sleep time, your leisure time, your occupation, your transportation, and your home. Those are all the domains of life. And be like, when am I in community and when am I not? And see how that plots. And then see where you could stack the function of community into these other domains.
I love that. I love that. I'm going to be thinking about the shape of my my community, and I think that that was a big part of my movement why when I worked through my perfect movement plan. As I identified my why, a lot of it was around community. I've spent the last year here on the farm alone in a very like rural community, and it's been really interesting to kind of work to learn the skill of building community as somebody who did not have a good example or elder for that growing up, and how I can mobilize myself in some ways to move my body to and with and for my community here. And so it is a skill, and I think the geese are a perfect example of, we see this and sort of, I call them animal teachers. I raise goats, and something I've been thinking about is the way that they allow others to rest completely. Ruminant animals don't do they don't sleep in quite the same way that we do, right? In these sort of big blocks of time, totally out. I know that you talk about the way that whales never rest because half of their brain has to be on for surfacing and getting air. And I think that some of these prey species have something that's turned on. But I've been resting with my goats some as I explore what rest means to me, and sitting out there with them. And I notice if I take a full nap, that all the goats will kind of ring around me. Or if another goat is fully out, right, not just cud chewing, they'll ring around them. And so I think that we're given these beautiful shapes of communities as maybe examples, whether it's a V of geese or, sort of a ring of goats, whatever that
Being
is.
part of a flock. I love that. I mean, I just did my own podcast episode on animals, movement within animals because
It was incredible.
you're right,
The
right.
chickens, yeah, it was so
Yes,
good.
that's right. And because I mean, I have this picture of my son sleeping on one of our sheep. I should send it to you because it was just moment of um, everyone was just relaxed in the field, and also how safe the sheep would feel with someone
Yeah.
sleeping on them, right? And I feel like our we've talked about the shape of our community. This is going to be with me forever. So thank you very much for this interview because shape of community will be something that'll be like my next big thing because I do see, I talk about like how many animal friendships do you have? What's your animal skill set? Like are you able to be in relationship with non-human animals? Because I think we're sort of well, someone else calls it species queer. There's like,
There's it there's a beautiful quote from Melanie Challenger, and she says that one of our human superpowers is our affiliative biology, and it's the resurfacing of oxytocin across species boundaries, that our capability to love, I don't know, that to love
yeah.
other animals is incredible.
Yeah, and I just think like there's a bunch of languages going on around us that we're not tuned into, and I feel like you're developing quite like your community shape. I had you map out and say, are you with others in community? So maybe it's actually pretty full. And then you can start to see if you want to add humans or not. Maybe you don't want to add humans. Like maybe your
Yeah.
community cup is full in that way. But
Mm.
that being said, we would have to look at back to the movement lens to see is human to human community necessary for some of this movement sharing because my chickens can't really do that much. They certainly do. I don't eat my chickens, but I eat their eggs. So they are out there making food for me.
Yes.
And in turn, I, get them the food or the protection or the others that support them, the plant life, whatever it is, like we're in
Mhm.
relationship with each other.
Mm.
And I do think, though, this movement stuff is going to require probably some other humans too. So I'm slowly
Please.
writing another chapter to my book in
No,
my mind.
no, please. And this is I like a pause, and I like it when weird things synthesize for somebody on the podcast. So,
Yeah.
you know, feel free to explore it.
Well, that's just it. It's just yeah. There's a lot of nuance to community, and we need community exercises, just like all the other body. It's like give me the program so I can be thinking about where to add or what to add. So for
Mm.
some people, it might be animals
Yeah.
or a bird language class. I give a lot of instruction in my own platform about how to develop that. And Grow Wild is really about developing community, at least for parents, like support. It's very hard to, in this cultural model that we have where families are um, going alone for parenting. And sometimes that could be a single parent and a child, or a
Mhm.
single parent, multiple children. If you have two parents or a parent and an allo parent, to really bring in a bigger web so that your parenting looks more like a formation of geese flying,
Mhm.
and not just a bunch of people who have to stay in one place because it's very difficult to move when you're not moving in a pack.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's I just kept picturing you have a great line in Movement Matters around shunting resources and the way that trees do that, and how
Mhm.
often we're inclined to shunt resources in terms of monetary, but what is actually needed is sort of the sharing of movements within a community.
Well,
Um,
money's a great thing to give. Like, I don't want to
yes,
discourage anyone from donating,
yeah.
but it is again, it's easier physically um, to give money and just the movements to give money. Like, just if you looked at what is the biomechanical energetics that go into donation, it's very small. The time is very small, and
Mhm.
that's why it's our primary way of helping. Um, but it also means that if we always talk about assistance in that way, it's only the people who have extra money, that
Yeah.
can help and contribute. And so this idea of maybe what's needed is, a shared meal. Maybe what's needed is
Mhm.
to walk just not your kid home, but a couple other kids home after school. Like there's so many different ways we can talk about. They have lots of examples in my own work for that, but there's just other ways to think about
Yeah.
supporting others, because you cannot give a goose money if it needs a flight partner. Like it doesn't
No.
matter.
Yeah.
You could maybe hire another one. Like that's kind of our mentality.
Mhm.
But is it the same? I'm
Hmm.
not sure.
I know we're getting close on time and I want to be respectful of your time. And so I think maybe a way to wrap this up is to actually, that in that episode where you talked about animal sedentarism, which was so fantastic. I sent it to a friend of mine who's a bird. She works with bird behavior. And we talked about it some, and throughout Movement Matters, and I think a little bit in my Perfect Movement Plan, you talk about vitamin awareness. And something I loved at the front of that episode was learning the language of your chickens, some of their calls, right? Like it's the learning how to observe, how to listen. And the way that I see this is that we're learning how to observe and listen to our bodies, to our
Mhm.
communities, and that there is a skill set again there of coming into awareness of what the tool that is our body might need and what shape it's making throughout the day. And again, this idea of community shapes too. And some of that is awareness and observation and listening and learning how to call back to your chickens. I do that with my baby goat. I try to call back to my bottle baby this year. I
Mhm.
try to call back to her.
Yeah, it's nice to have lots of different ways to connect, right? Some of them are touch, some of them are verbal.
Mhm.
There's a lot of fluencies to develop.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I do think, awareness, we're used to using the word mindfulness. And I wonder if I would use mindfulness and awareness interchangeably. Like, I do think that my approach to movement is about becoming more mindful. And mindful is being maybe seeing what's going on in front of you more clearly. With the bird language example, if you're outside, you are in the middle of someone's discussion. You're in a room where communication is going on. Like, and if you've ever been in a restaurant, you can tune in to hearing someone else's conversation, or you can tune out and not pick it up.
Yeah. Hmm.
And I think we're really tuned out for a lot of things that are going on. Like, it's whether it's protective, maybe that's um how, as I think of our body as like, because our hardware and our software is quite primitive. I mean, literally, but in primitive in the metaphorical, like it's very rudimentary. It's old, um, and we're in an arcade, and so where our attention is sort of being co-opted by this arcade
Mhm.
that's going on around us. So I wouldn't be adverse to the idea that retreating, decreasing awareness is protective
Mm.
in some way.
Yeah.
Um, when you're in a place where like neurological overwhelm, sensory overwhelm is possible, then sort of retreating makes sense to me. It's like, seems
Yeah.
like it would
Me
be
too.
a survival mechanism.
Yes.
So, one, you're going to try to decrease the arcade places of your life, if that's what you're interested in, and then getting outside, um, and recognizing, okay, I can start tuning back in, because there's benefits to what we were tuning out. We might have tuned out the arcade, but we ended up tuning out everything as well. So, including communication from our own bodies, right? You're like, I just can't take in this much stuff. Like, my brain and my body was just sitting outside for all millions of, million years, and didn't have to take in this much. And as everything got more and more, I mean, it's exponential, really, like the last 30 years,
It
like
is.
last 10 years.
Yeah.
It's like it's exponential across the board. So it's like unbelievably loud and clangy. Like, we're not just an arcade. We're like in a casino.
Mm-hmm.
It's like
Yes.
a 24-hour casino that never goes off. To take yourself out of the casino and then tune back in so you can hear yourself, you can hear the communication going on around you, because I do think that that's, a nutrient as well. It's part of how we're able to um, go forth. It's how we're able to heal our bodies. All of that, all those physiological mechanisms need that nutrient of awareness. Now I think I might want to call it connection too. Like it's, you're connecting to what's going on around you in some way.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really beautiful. Been thinking a lot about attention. There's a gentleman who's just on Ezra Klein podcast, but he sort of put together this book on attention and asking what attention was in the first place. I think so often that
Mm.
is co-opted in the names of more productivity and not more connection.
Mhm.
And that as we're in this casino, I don't want to be more selective with where my attention goes so that I can maybe all the time make more, build more, which is often how it's couched, but also so that I can connect more or rest more or
Mhm.
well, no, there's something in there. And so I really love that as somebody who I mean, I think we're all struggling with the noise. And I do think it's a healthy response to kind of come back in, and what would it take to come back out?
Mhm.
Mm.
Stepping outside.
Stepping outside,
At
listening.
minimum outside the casino. At minimum outside the casino.
Yeah.
At most, just outside. Like, you don't really need to do that much more than that.
Yeah. And I think that, I think that's a good place of asking yourself why. Like, why am I doing this? That really struck me in
Mhm.
trying to find my own why. And so I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate all of your work. I mean, I'll say it again, but I don't think I've dog-eared or as it were audio bookmarked. I use the bookmark function on Audible a lot. A book more than Movement Matters and Move Your DNA. I really love the holistic and deeply interconnected, web of ideas that you build around movement.
Well, one, I did not know that audiobooks had a bookmark function, so thanks for that. And two, thanks for having me. This was great. This was a beautiful discussion about the broadest view of my body of writing and thoughts. So thanks for letting me spend some time here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And we'll have links to everything in the show notes to where to find you and the podcast and all of your books. So
Thank
thank
you.
you,
Thanks so
Katy.
much.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. If what you found resonated with you, may I ask that you share it with your friends or leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts? This act of reciprocity helps others find Mind, Body, and Soil. If you're looking for more, you can find us at groundworkcollective.com and at Kate_Kavanaugh, that's KATE_KAVANAUGH on Instagram. I would like to give a very special thank you to China and Seth Kent of the band All Right for the clips from their beautiful song Over the Edge from their album The Crucible. You can find them at All Right on Instagram and wherever you listen to music.